So you're likely already familiar with my Adirondack chair design, and if not, welcome aboard. They're surprisingly comfortable, with a curved back and seat, and a few years back I leveled it up with a hidden pull-out leg rest. And then last year I created what I call my Adirondack dining chair, a more upright version that's an easier sitting experience for tall people, people with bad knees, old people, and fat people.
I'm pregnant.
Oh. My newest design is big news. Well, it's actually small. It's a kid-sized version of the classic Adirondack chair. And I was even able to retain the hidden leg rest mechanism at the smaller size.
Here.
What?
See it right there.
Where? Right here? Right here?
Hey! What was that? Where'd you get that?
I began the build process by planing down my rough sawn material, which in this case is white oak, that I use for its weather and rot resistance. The boards are planed down to 3/4 and 1/2 inch thick. The kid-sized chair is designed pretty similar to my regular Adirondack chair, but tweaked in a few places to optimize it for the smaller size, including using different thicknesses for certain pieces. This keeps the chair from looking too chunky, while still maintaining the structural integrity, so it can stand up to an unpredictable toddler. I cut templates for all the parts from MDF on my laser cutter, and actually offer templates like these on my website along with digital plans, so you can build one of these for yourself. Or there's even a digital template option if you prefer to cut out your own templates. The kids' chair templates are brand new, but I have templates available for all of my chair designs, and I have a site-wide sale going on right now through the end of the month, 20% off everything. Details are down below. Ooh, blacked out there for a second. Where were we? Oh yeah, templates. Because of all the curves, the templates are a must. I trace all the pieces this way, optimizing the layout to result in the least amount of waste, doing some creative positioning, like 69ing these arm pieces together. And for straight pieces, like these back slats, I just mark the ends so that I know where they're located on my board. All the straight cuts will be done on the table saw, so they don't need to be cut to a line, like the curved cuts do. Generally speaking, I start with the larger parts and work my way down to the smaller parts, since they can often fit into blank spaces between the larger parts. Also, the curve of the parts create a convenient way to skip around knots and imperfections in your lumber. Once the pieces are laid out, I like to break down the boards into a more manageable length of about 4 to 6 feet. Sometimes I'll luck out and be able to do this on the miter saw, but otherwise I just roughly cut around the curves with a jigsaw to split the boards up at the most logical point. Now I find all of the boards that have a flat part laid out along the edges and bring them over to my jointer to flatten those edges. This board here is a perfect example of where I was able to avoid knots while laying out the pieces. An alternative to a jointer is a jointing sled on your table saw, or just a circular saw with a clamped on fence. The templates come in handy when cutting out the pieces. I use them to set the fence on my table saw to rip all of the straight pieces to width. I then use my table saw, along with a miter gauge, to cut all of the same pieces to length. And now it's time to move over to the bandsaw to cut all of the curved shapes. I use a wider blade for all of the shallow curves, and then switch over to a thinner blade for any of the steeper curves. You want to cut just outside your line so that you can either sand down to the line later, or use the templates as router templates with a flush trim bit. And sanding is the next step. I use my edge sander to take off any burn marks or saw marks on all of the straight pieces, and I'm also able to tackle the outside curves here too, and then move to the spindle part of the sander to take care of the inside curves. Some people prefer to use a flush trim router bit using the templates for this step, but my personal preference is just to sand down to the line instead. I find it to be quicker and easier and just about as accurate. Next, all of the pieces are sent through the drum sander to smooth out both faces. This removes any potential tear out left behind from the planer on some curly grain pieces, but it also removes the little fuzz left behind on the corners that you get when sanding the edges. I'm sure there's a better name for it than that, but I'm just going to call it fuzz. Once the pieces are as smooth as my carefully cultivated woodworking persona, I move over to the router. Many of these sharp corners are treated to a round over to both improve the appearance of the finished chair, but also make the pieces feel nicer against your body. After all, you wouldn't want to get a splinter in your, but the only parts that take some planning ahead is laying out the back slats so you only round over the front edges. You can see me marking the front faces here, and this also allows you to put any imperfections on the back side of these pieces. The rest of the pieces are pretty straightforward, just rounded over with a slight difference in radius depending on the different thicknesses of the pieces. I like to seal up the end grain of the feet as a preventative measure, since if the chairs are going to rot, that's likely where it's going to start. For this, I mix up some Total Boat high performance epoxy and apply it to both the bottom of the front and the back legs. I do this epoxy work at the end of the day so it can cure overnight, aging like a fine wine. Speaking of fine products, use my link in the description to save 5% off Total Boat, including their epoxies, paints, varnishes, and more. Guess what? We're not done sanding yet. I clean all the parts up with some finish sanding with a random orbital sander. This also includes the pieces I just applied epoxy to. I'm not sanding enough to remove the epoxy, just enough to flatten out any drips, and also to scuff up the epoxy so that the varnish will stick to it later. Clamping the sander in a vise is a great trick when working with small pieces, but also to make it easier to rotate the pieces to sand down all the rounded over edges and soften the sharp edges too. Now the final step in preparation for assembly is pre-drilling all of the holes where the pieces will get fastened together. I use the holes in my templates to mark out the locations for pre-drilling using a center punch, which has the benefit of not just marking the locations, but also creating a starter hole to help align the drill bit. Doing this now rather than during the layout process is due to the fact that parts may shift around slightly between layout and actually cutting out the pieces, so I recommend doing it now to ensure accuracy. The diameter of the hole that you want needs to be slightly larger than your screw. You don't want your screws threading into the piece that you're attaching, just the piece that you're attaching to. I don't know if that sentence makes any sense, but you know what I mean. For the repetitive hole locations, I pull out this beauty, which is a drill press fence from MagSwitch, which attaches to your drill press table magnetically with switchable magnets. There's also a stop block that attaches to the fence magnetically, which I set in place by drilling my hole and then using that to line up the stop block. I love how non-fussy it is, just like all their other tools. Probably worth mentioning that if you want to be cool like me, you could save 10% on all MagSwitch tools by using code Jackman at checkout. I'll drop a link in the description. Now, given that white oak is a pretty hard material, I also go ahead and countersink the outside faces of all these holes. That's so the head of the screw will later sit flush with the surface. With something softer like pine or cedar, I just skip this step, since all the screws can pull themselves flush with the softer woods during assembly. Alright, after all that prep work, it's finally time to put the chair together. Now, much of the assembly process is done by eye, but a little bit of measuring is sprinkled in when necessary. I start with the back of the chair, centering all of the back slats on their two back support pieces. The center back slat is fastened in place first, and then measured for square, and the two back supports are measured to make sure that they're parallel before fanning out the remaining back slats and screwing them in place. Since this is a pretty hard material, I pre-drill all of these hole locations with a smaller drill bit to keep the screws from breaking and keeping the more fragile ends of the pieces from cracking when you screw into them. I set the backs to the side for now while I assemble the legs. This takes a line parallel with the pre-drilled holes and a little bit of measuring to line things up. But once that's done, I clamp the pieces together to temporarily hold them in place and then screw them together. I make a pair of these that are a mirrored version of each other. Then I bring all of these pieces together by lining up the back of the chair in the notch of the main leg and screwing these pieces together. Shout out to my favorite hearing protection, Isotunes. These are the Link Aware earmuffs, and you saw me wearing the free Aware in-ear earlier in the video. They're hearing protection with built-in Bluetooth headphones, so it's PPE you actually want to wear. I can't say enough good things about them. There's a reason I'm always wearing them. And they have a massive sale going on right now through the end of the month. Code Jackman30 gets you 30% off almost everything on their site. Link is in the description. Alright, stop shilling, Jackman. Back to the chair. You'll notice I attached the front slat to one of the chairs, but not the other. That's because the chair with the leg rest will have this piece attached later. The seat slats can now be added to the chair. The pair of slats between the front legs needs to be trimmed to fit, but all the rest can be installed as is. The backmost slat is installed tight with the back of the chair, and the frontmost slat is attached in front of the front legs, and then the rest are just spread out evenly in between. I do one side at a time, and I use shims to help with this process to make sure that they're as even as possible and perfectly parallel too. The back leg is added by screwing it to the back of the main leg and the upper part of the seat back, which solidifies the back of the chair, but also creates a place to install the arms, which get screwed to the back leg and also get screwed to the front legs to lock everything together. Now that wraps up the regular chair, but the one with the leg rest gets a couple extra pieces glued to the inside of the main leg, which are the rails for the leg rest to run along and also for storing it. The leg rest is made from a bunch of slats and some curved rails that are all assembled in a very familiar way, attaching the front and the back slat, squaring the whole assembly, and then adding the rest of the slats with even spacing in between. Smooth, Jackman. Real smooth. Instead of fastening the wide front slat to the chair, it's instead fastened to the leg rest. And I do this when it's installed in the chair to ensure that it lines up perfectly. The final parts of the leg rest are the fold-out legs, which are attached together, and then attached to the underside of the front of the leg rest, by loosely screwing it in place so there's enough friction to hold it when it's in its collapsed position, but it's loose enough to still flip it down by hand. I install the leg rest in place and pull it to the outermost position and then mark the point where it intersects the chair rails. A file is used to create a groove, which is what will register the leg rest in the correct location when you pull it out. And after all of that hard work, the chairs are completely disassembled. I do this to make applying finish easier. You don't have to, you could spray the assembled chair with varnish. But now that the hard part is done of lining everything up, the chair will go back together in 1/10 of the time, maybe less. There's also a good opportunity to do a quick touch-up sanding on all of the pieces to remove any fuzz from the holes that were pre-drilled in place, and also to remove any lingering pencil lines. All of the parts are spread out on a sheet of cardboard so that they can be sprayed with varnish, which in this case is Totalboat's Halcyon Clear Varnish, which I run through a filter into my HVLP sprayer. I only sand after the first coat because the varnish raises the grain in some spots, but other than that, with this varnish at least, there's no sanding between coats, so I can quickly build up coats. In total, I did 10 on all of the chair parts. Once the varnish dries, I'm able to reassemble both of the chairs and the leg rest. A much easier process this time, since I've already done all of the thinking. Well, sit down in your new chair and relax. Well, I guess not this time. But now we have a completed chair, so the little human in your life has a chair that perfectly matches yours, even including the multi-position leg rest. Don't say I never do anything nice for you. As I said before, plans and templates are available for these on my website. The link is included down where you find links. The plans are incredibly comprehensive to make these super easy for you to build for yourself without me holding your hand, because that would be weird.
We did already.
Here, I'll show you what it looks like.